Today's video was sponsored by Supremacy World War III, a free online PvP strategy game. Try it out using my link and support the channel today. So the situation in the war for the Black Sea around Crimea right now is absolutely insane, and it continues to get worse for the Russians on a daily basis, without exaggeration. Now every morning when I log in, one of the first things I see is an updated tally and an updated video of all of the Russian ships that Ukraine has disabled in the Black Sea and in the Sea of Azov, but increasingly in the Black Sea. Ukraine is sieging Crimea right now, and that means preventing all shipborne traffic, all maritime traffic, from reaching the peninsula. But having been so effective at that, it seems that their aims have now increased, and they are increasing their campaign to threaten all Russian shipping across the entire Black Sea. It's still ongoing, but I think that's an objective Ukraine will ultimately achieve now or in the near future. And as for the Russians, they have absolutely no response to this. It turns out that this is just the second phase in a campaign that Ukraine started years ago. The first phase being Ukraine basically disabling or rendering ineffective the entire Russian Black Sea fleet, which they either sunk directly or caused to flee because it was so afraid of being sunk by Ukrainian drones. The Black Sea fleet is now not really intervening in these massive Ukrainian attacks across Black Sea shipping, which is kind of the entire point of having a fleet in a particular body of water in the first place. But this is Russia we're talking about. And Russia's only real response to this has been to tell ships to basically not enter the area, which as far as Ukraine is concerned is just fine and good. A ship that never enters the area to pick up a shipment in the first place is almost as bad for the Russian economy as a ship that Ukraine was able to physically strike. It actually just saves Ukraine the cost of the drone. But Russia has increasingly had another response, not to try to prevent the Ukrainian attacks, but to respond in kind. And Russia's response has been to attack Ukrainian grain ships, with a lot of caveats that are important to mention here. First and foremost, the number of attacks on Ukrainian grain ships that Russia has been successful in are far less than the attacks that Ukraine has been successful in against Russian shipping. But at the same time, a couple of successes have been enough, at least for the time being, to prevent grain ships from wanting to enter Ukrainian ports. And a lot of people are really panicking and are really worried about this, in my opinion, for no reason at all, for reasons I'll soon explain in this video. And that shouldn't really be a surprise to us, because it turns out that the mastermind behind this campaign, Magyar, the Ukrainian man in charge of the Black Sea campaign in the Sea of Azov and Ukraine's drone forces in general, was in his former life a grain trader. In fact, that detail should give anybody worried about this campaign a lot of comfort. Because on the Ukrainian side, the person conducting the campaign doesn't just understand the warfare, he also personally understands the economics. He understands the economics of maritime trade and of grain trade specifically. And he is conducting a campaign that is bringing Ukraine a lot of asymmetric benefits, because he clearly understands his craft far more than his Russian counterparts do. This is actually a massive difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians in real time. In the Ukrainian world, the people with expertise who have built up wealth through skill and trade are actually fighting on the side of the Ukrainian military for the independence of their country. On the Russian side, a lot of the oligarchs who have quote-unquote expertise in business are explicitly avoiding the war and the conflict zones, preferring to send people who know nothing but who will obey orders to conduct their military strategy. This is creating a huge divergence and a huge asymmetry, and it's the reason that Ukraine is categorically, without a doubt, winning the war for the Black Sea. Yes, Ukraine has costs, but in context, you realize that the Russians are suffering far, far more. We have a lot to discuss in today's video, a lot of details that I promise you will have heard nowhere else. So, let's get right into it. If you're fascinated by military strategy, you'll likely enjoy the sponsor of today's video, Supremacy World War III, a free online PvP strategy game where you can command a modern nation's economy, diplomacy, and high-tech armed forces. Supremacy World War III is a phenomenal game available on PC and mobile, where you can put your strategic skills to the test, leading a real country in modern global warfare, as you compete against up to 99 other players in real time in games that take place over weeks. It's a true deep strategy game, where you can build your army with modern tech, ranging from tanks to jets to submarines, while you also work to forge alliances, declare wars, and conquer the world. Supremacy features advanced mechanics, like advanced research trees, where you can unlock cutting-edge military technology. You can choose your strategy, engage in battles strategically, and conquer the world against real player opposition. Right now, viewers of my channel can get started on Supremacy World War III for free, along with an exclusive starter pack containing a free elite railgun unit, a value of $40 US. Just click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen to claim your bonus and to support the channel. That offer is valid for the next 30 days, so don't delay. And thanks again to Supremacy World War III for sponsoring today's video. So now let's get into the strategy behind Ukraine's current war for the Black Sea, which at its core is an economic strategy trying to do damage to the Russians while taking less damage on the Ukrainian side. At its core, this is no different from any other Ukrainian strategy. Do damage to the Russians at a lower cost than the Russians have to experience. It's not a zero-cost strategy, it is a low-cost strategy, and that is incredibly important to understand. Because it means that Ukraine, before they did these attacks, factored in what we're currently seeing today. The fact that Ukrainian grain exports are now, once again, getting attacked by the Russians, causing a large loss of revenue for the Ukrainians. It's really important to break down the actual details here to realize why you shouldn't actually be worried. And as I get into that, it's important that I do something that I don't often do, which is try to boost my own credibility, not to brag or to boast, but to explain why you should listen to me when you see a lot of headlines that are telling you to panic. I actually do have some credibility here, because recently we had a similar crisis start in the Strait of Hormuz, where there were a lot of expert predictions about oil prices that I disagreed with, and in the end, it turned out that my predictions were correct and the experts were woefully wrong. You see, when the Strait of Hormuz was closed, everybody panicked about how high oil prices would get. And we saw sky-high estimates that oil prices would reach somewhere between $155 and $200 US per barrel, something that would have been truly apocalyptic from an economic standpoint. But as soon as that crisis broke out, I made a video saying that that was not going to be the case, because people were not factoring in several different things, which was that when the Strait of Hormuz is closed, first of all, there are alternative trade routes, even though they don't make up all of the supply, that can take a lot of the capacity and cause a lot of the damage to be greatly lessened. There's also the fact that when things reach a certain price, other routes, other aspects of getting oil became viable that weren't viable at the lower price, meaning that there was a hard limit to how bad things could get, and that ended up being true. Far from reaching a price of $155 to $200 US per barrel, prices peaked somewhere around under $130 per barrel. Still high, again, we're not talking about a no-damage scenario, but also far less than the panic would imply. And that is a very good analogy for what's happening with Ukraine's grain exports right now. Because it turns out Ukraine's grain exports will take a hit. But once you understand everything in context, you realize these grain exports are actually going to be just fine in the end. On the flip side, as you'll see, the same thing cannot be said for Russian shipping. Because while Ukraine has a lot of alternatives to preserve most of their grain revenue, even if Russia does the worst that they possibly can, for the things that Ukraine is attacking, Russia doesn't actually have a viable alternative to. The revenue that Russia is losing will just be lost, where Ukraine will threaten up to $3 billion US in revenue for the Russians every single month, while losing on the Ukrainian side a theoretical maximum of somewhere around $170 million US one time. Now, I realize I haven't defended that at all yet, but that's what the rest of the video is for. I want you to know the conclusion that we're actually driving to. And it comes actually down to a fundamental difference between what Ukraine is disrupting and what Russia is disrupting, which is the difference between grain and oil. Oil revenues work in a particular way. Oil is consistently pumped, and the more that you can ship, the more money that you can actually make. Russia needs to have ships arriving at their ports at a continual basis to actually pick up the oil that's being produced for Russia to earn any money on that. And if that system slows down too much, it actually creates bottlenecks that in a worst case scenario could cause Russia to shut down infrastructure that can be difficult or expensive to restart, especially in Siberia, the cold regions of Russia where a lot of their oil production happens. Russia, when they lose export capacity in the Black Sea, they are permanently losing revenue that they don't really have a chance to regain. On the other hand, grain is completely different. Grain is only harvested at certain times of the year. And that means that even though you can slow down shipping, as long as that grain is harvested and stored securely, you can actually still get that grain to the world markets, just maybe on a different timeline, maybe for a different price than you were originally anticipating. And there's actually a lot of factors here that could actually be more favorable to Ukraine in terms of the price that they can ultimately get if they wait a little bit longer, rather than actually taking their grain to market today. As I said, the mastermind behind this plan was a grain trader with an estimated net worth I've heard of up to 50 million US dollars before he actually joined the Ukrainian military and started fighting the Russians. This man knows exactly what he's doing. So that being said, let's get into the specifics now. A lot of headlines have come out just today that are absolutely panicking about the situation in Ukraine's grain ports right now. And I'm even seeing some implicit questioning of, is it worth it for Ukraine to strike Russia's infrastructure when Russia responds in kind? And the numbers we're seeing are just drastic. Now, they're just coming out. I actually don't even know if they're defensible, but let's just take the worst case headlines that we're currently seeing on their surface. We're seeing numbers like a third of Ukrainians' port capacity is basically useless right now because the ships are no longer taking calls for grain, and that's very disruptive. A huge portion, above 90% of Ukraine's grain export capacity in general, goes through these ports. So that means essentially a third of Ukraine's export capacity has potentially been lost due to Russian strikes. Sounds really bad on the surface. And the number I'm seeing thrown around is that Ukraine has just lost the equivalent of about $900 million US dollars a month in export capacity. Now that sounds really bad, but again, even if you take that on its surface, this is in exchange for Ukraine threatening potentially an upper limit of $3 billion US dollars a month on the Russian side just in oil, not even counting grain exports. But I'm not actually really including the grain exports here for reasons I'll explain on the Ukrainian side. All of this sounds very bad, but it doesn't factor in the major thing that I just said about grain, which is the fact that you can actually store the harvest and you can wait for a period of time where you can actually export it. And that harvest storage is actually not that expensive. Now, to that point, it turns out that we actually have some current facts and figures to work with here. And these are coming from Ukraine's agriculture minister, which is about as authoritative of a source as we could possibly get. And they are not framing the shipping blockade of their ports as a massive crisis. It's just a problem to be solved. And they're certainly not throwing around a $900 million US dollars a month cost. In fact, the worst case scenario is being framed around storage. And they have said that for the current harvest, Ukraine actually has more than enough storage capacity. They will be just fine. Basically, if people are willing to wait out the crisis, there will be little to no cost, and potentially no cost when we consider where the grain market is going, but I'll explain that in just a moment. As long as people are willing to wait to realize revenues, they'll be just fine. That's not a zero-cost scenario, because you want to get capital quickly so you can reinvest it, but it's about as close to zero cost as we could possibly get, considering how things are being framed. That said, the situation could become worse if Russia does continue their attacks on Ukrainian grain ships, and Ukraine can't respond to those attacks. If this happens and Ukraine cannot resume exports from their seaports, there's another worst-case scenario that's been defined by the agriculture minister, and once again, it's not nearly as bad as most people think. This turns out that Ukraine would need to build an additional storage capacity of between 10 and 12 million tons to store their harvests that are upcoming that they wouldn't be able to export fast enough. Now that again is not zero cost, but we do have an estimate of what that might cost. And when we look at other situations, for example in Japan and Canada, a good estimate for how much 1 million tons of grain storage would cost is approximately 20 million US dollars. Now for Ukraine, because they might need between 10 and 12 million, that puts a theoretical worst case cost somewhere between 200 and 240 million US dollars. Now is that a cost? Of course it is. Is that the same as 900 million US dollars a month? No, it's not even close. We're not even in the same league. And the reason things are this way is because while Ukraine's seaports are their most efficient route to export, they are not Ukraine's only export route. In fact, in the past, Ukraine has had this exact problem, and they've actually had to shore up and figure out alternatives. And they can do that through freight, either on rail or trucks, or by going through the Danube River. Not as efficient as the seaports, a little bit more expensive per ton of grain to export, but not impossible to achieve, certainly by any means. In fact, earlier in this war, under duress, Ukraine had to figure out how to transit grain without the use of their seaports. And they found that while doing that, again, under duress, kind of figuring things out on the fly, they were able to export approximately 3.5 million tons of grain per month. And that's a significant figure. That is enough to get rid of a lot of the grain, to export a lot of the grain that's needed between harvest seasons, so Ukraine can make use of its current storage. They just sell the grain over a longer period of time, and everything kind of works out. It's a bit of a higher transport cost. As far as war goes, this is really not a terrible solution. I've seen a lot of errors here. For example, I saw one article, I won't mention it, I'll have some dignity here, but I saw one article saying that Ukraine could only transit approximately 100,000 tons of grain per month on its river networks, and that's because that's currently what Ukraine is doing. Completely missing the fact that people wouldn't use the river networks if the more efficient sea networks were available. The 100,000 tons a month is not Ukraine's maximum capacity, that's just what they're doing right now when they have better options. But Ukraine can adapt and they can overcome. And what they can do today is almost certainly much better than what they did back several years ago, because they're no longer responding under duress. They now have solutions that have been figured out precisely because they expected that this might happen to them again. Ukraine can stop the strikes on grain ships much better than they were able to earlier in the war, and also their infrastructure is much better designed around alternative routes. Long story short, TLDR, Ukraine will be just fine when it comes to their grain exports. In fact, what a lot of people are missing here is that this could actually be a genuinely good outcome for Ukraine, where they actually end up fetching a better overall net price than they would have if this Black Sea war was not going on. Because right now there's something happening to the global grain markets. Prices are going up. And the reason prices are going up is largely because of what's happening to Russia, one of the world's major grain exporters. Farmers in Russia right now are having a hard time bringing in their crop because they can't get fuel, because Ukraine has been striking the Russian refineries. And this is causing crop failures. This is different. You can't just store a crop on a field. You have to actually harvest that crop, and then once the crop is dried out, at that point the crop becomes durable and you can export it whenever you want. But the Russians right now are having a problem where they can't even harvest their crop, and in many cases they're missing the window, which means a lot of grain that Russians paid and invested in planting, they can't harvest, and they're really losing out. Simultaneously, Ukraine is also cutting off Russian grain exports that come through the Sea of Azov. Now, similar to Ukraine, Russia also has a river network by which they can transit some of this more inefficiently up to the Baltic Sea, but that still incurs a higher cost. And so while Ukraine is having to incur higher costs, that is increasingly being reflected in the overall global market prices. And as Russia misses a big portion of this year's harvest, it could be that it will probably be that grain prices will be more favorable for Ukraine at the time that they actually get their product to the market. So there's actually no big rush right now, no big thing forcing Ukraine to export grain at this exact moment. And they can make more money to recover from grain shortages in the world market if they get things out a little bit later. Again, as I said, this is a strategy that was orchestrated by a man who made a fortune as a grain trader, and it really shows. You can see those fingerprints all over the place. So in net, what we see right now is that Ukraine is cutting Russia off, not just from the Sea of Azov, but increasingly from the Black Sea, a major area of significance to the entire country of Russia. And they're doing it in such a way that is actually incurring a very low cost on themselves, even though on the surface, that cost can be framed as absolutely catastrophic. The Russians, though, are really losing out. And this is more significant than a lot of people realize. Russia's strategy as a country, as a nation, since the time of empire, has really consisted of them pushing out towards as many oceans as they can get access to. Access to the Black Sea, access to the Baltic Sea. Russia has fought a lot of wars over precisely these things. And now Russia has been cut off by Ukraine from one of their areas that has long been considered a big part of their geopolitical importance. If Ukraine can cut off Russia from the Black Sea, it is not an exaggeration to say that Russia has become largely irrelevant in the world market. They still have alternatives, but it makes Russia look really weak in general when they are completely incapable of even attempting to defend what is one of their biggest geopolitical interests in their entire country. It really shows you where this war has come and how poorly Russia is actually performing. Ukraine, a country that did not have a navy when this war started, except for a very small number of ships, is now eliminating Russia in the naval front of the war, and it's absolutely humiliating. Now, if you learned something new today, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. That helps me out a lot, and it ensures that you will see future episodes if you enjoy them. Also, before you go, consider becoming a YouTube channel member or a patron. You guys who choose to support me really help out a lot, and you allow me to do this as my full-time job. Again, I hope